My name is Joseph Wunderlich. I'm a professor of engineering, architecture, and computer science. This is the third part of a lecture series on Frank Lloyd Wright, separated into parts of his life by ages. I will go very rapidly through this, and I'd like the students to come back and take time to go through the links and read more carefully. In this third part of our lecture series, we're covering his ages 34 to 41 from 1901 to 1908. And so he has his first trip to Japan in 1906. The arts and crafts movement have some influence that started in Britain, then came to the United States. He has 6 children now at this time. And this is where he really establishes his prairie school style and becomes famous for this. This is where he starts becoming famous the most. And then Oak Park and River Forest, they're right next to each other. You can't forget about River Forest. There's a lot going on there, including the River Forest Tennis Club, where he's probably meeting clients. Unity Temple is then built right after coming back from Japan, and you can see some similarities there. Japanese influence. Roby House on the University of Chicago campus, certainly. Larkin Building, unfortunately, got torn down, but we'll see a simulated reconstruction of it, because that was somewhat of a groundbreaking kind of design for office building with open spaces and plants and lots of sunlight and an organ built into the building. A beautiful work environment. These are the majority of the references that I've used for these this lecture series, and they're worth taking a look at, each of them individually when you have time. Let's first have a quick review of his formative years between birth and age 33, and then this lecture is all about his work and life and accomplishments between age 34 and 41. So let's recall his earliest influences up until age 19. His mother and father, certainly, and a Unitarian family and the farmland he grew up in. His mother's teaching using the Froebel methods, and Froebel, long before Frank Lloyd Wright was even born, developed in Germany these methods, and he himself was influenced by Asian things, as Frank Lloyd Wright would later be. So there's 2 connections to some of the Asian influences in philosophy that you could see in Frank Lloyd Wright's work. His father was a musician, and that's what he ended up being most well known for, and publishing. And then Frank Lloyd Wright would have music in his school that he eventually opened in the fellowship, and would put pianos in many of his designs. Now, Maria Montessori is shown here in parallel, but she did not directly influence Frank Lloyd Wright, because she was not of age to do that yet. She did her developments in parallel to the time Frank Lloyd Wright did, but she was also influenced by Froebel methods. And so I have this future designers parallel paths there with Frank Lloyd Wright and Maria Montessori. Let's recall some previous influence on his design up until this time. He lived in New England and Wisconsin, Oak Park suburb. His father and mother were a big influence, and along with a number of architects. The machine, the Industrial Revolution was happening, rebuilding of Chicago, the Chicago World's Fair, where he saw the Japanese pavilion for the first time, seeing Japanese architecture, makes his own home and studio in Oak Park, starts his own practice, designs homes in Oak Park. So we're looking now at after age 34. He's looking at the machine, the industrial machine influence on the times, and how to deal with that. He says quantity production was already an inflexible necessity, either as enemy or friend. Commercial machine standardization had taken the life of handcraft. I wanted to realize genuine new forms. This is my own summary slide I'm inserting into all of the lectures based on the refinement of everything Frank Lloyd Wright said, conforming to the site, pinwheel planes, cruciforms, broad chimneys, and long overhangs in the prairie style, certainly folded plane in the form, human scale, form and function R1, simple geometries like the formal blocks, open floor plan, orchestrating the sun, destroying the box, natural state of materials flowing in between inside and outside, bands of windows, framing views, the Engawa, compression and release technique to magnify the final space, natural materials, innovating materials, warm, optimistic tones, and fixtures, furniture built in, music everywhere, music in the architecture itself, inspirations from Japan and Italy. Now, in this time period from ages 34 to 41, we're going to look at his prairie-style homes and how those are formed, the concepts behind that, and these designs will be that we'll look at that I'll look at here are primarily in Oak Park and River Forest, or in the Midwest in general, and we took a tour of Oak Park home and studio, and also another one in Unity Temple. We didn't do the tour of the neighborhoods, which are many of these buildings. We made our own virtual tour that you can see in this video log if you go to my YouTube channel, and of 31 different sites in and around Chicago. And this first picture here is the gate to River Forest. So first we look at the floor plane, and then the ceiling plane, and then you rotate two pairs of floor and ceiling planes, and you make the cruciform. Now we also need to understand the vertical planes as well as the horizontal planes, and the perception of a plane, and how that is formed in the abstract. And so you can see that a colonnade will create a perceptual plane. You can do this in a number of ways, even with changing ceiling heights and with lighting, and with bands of windows and bands of doors. And then when you combine the cruciform with the perceptual vertical planes, you can facilitate the open plans and indoor-outdoor spaces that Frank Lloyd Wright is well known for. This is an important video. Come back and you could stop and watch this now, or come back later and watch this about the Engawa. I mentioned this as a footnote in a previous lecture. I'd like you to take a look at this now, because we're talking about interior, exterior spaces, and the Japanese have mastered that for a long time. And Frank Lloyd Wright obviously was influenced by that. Now, the open floor plan by Frank Lloyd Wright is a common concept that he implemented in America. It existed before that in Japan, and he may have seen that in the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. These perceived separation between spaces are implemented through a number of architectural techniques, including screens, movable screens, as you can see in the picture here in the bottom left in Japan. You can also do it with colonnades and furnishing, lighting, changes in ceiling heights, and strategically aligning lines of sight between spaces. Now, his prairie style emphasizes the horizontal and also the open space, that the open floor plan is an extension of that. So he's saying, I extended horizontal spacing without enlarging the building by cutting out all the room partitions that did not serve the kitchen or give needed privacy. Freedom of floor space and elimination of useless heights. A sense of repose in flat planes and quiet streamline effects. So he's doing that on the interior of the building. He's also, in the overall shell of the building, in his prairie style, expands on his organic architecture, and he says plains close to the earth identify with the ground. So complementing wide open plains of the Midwest. Also speaking to his horizontal or horizontality, is also emphasized by low ceilings and bands of windows, having the wall above the window bands painted the same color as the ceiling, bands of interior horizontal trim, extending the roof overhangs, the cantilevers, also long cantilever balconies, exterior facades of horizontal board and batten or Roman brick, and then the folded plane comes into play, and like origami, all the walls, ceilings, and floors become one. And then the pinwheeled planes. And so the pinwheeled planes create the cruciform, and that is by rotating two pairs of floor and ceiling planes, if you can imagine that, and making them perpendicular, and that defines the overall form of the structure. Here is the first of three designs, often cited as the very first of Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie-style homes. This is the Willits House in Highland Park, Illinois, a suburb of northern part of Chicago. This is in Oak Park. This is the Frank W. Thomas House. You can see in my video log. And the third is the B. Harley Bradley House in Kankakee, Illinois, south of Chicago. And here are those three houses, with each of them considered the first of the Prairie School style by different scholars and different authors. However, you'll see also that Frank Lloyd Wright said that the Thomas House was his first prairie house, and had earlier also said that his 1894 Winslow residence was a prairie style. However, the Thomas House is more of the mature, established prairie school style with all of the accompanying features. So the cruciform plus perceived vertical planes, and examples of this, and the prairie style is the ultimate example of that. So a number of houses here. William Frick House, you can see in this video log. Now this is in the River Forest neighborhood next to Oak Park. This is the Isabella Roberts residence. You can see sticking up of the house, out of the house, what they just cut off there is a tree. There was a tree that was allowed to grow inside the house, and it got to a huge size, and they finally obviously had to cut it. And certainly the Roby House, a very important design. A good deal of pictures in that. And we did take a tour of that. That's a very popular one. This is on the University of Chicago campus. It's not in Oak Park. Now this is my wife's family from Batavia, Illinois, and her whole family is originally from Chicago on both sides. She grew up in her childhood in Chicago before going to California. This is a house of her grandfather, Carl Carlson, who was had an engineering firm and designed airplane hangars, met one of the Wright brothers. I could tell a whole story about him, a very wise man. Lived in 95, and this was the house that my wife went to her grandparents' house. You can see the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright here. Now, other things on the horizontal now. So we're still in this time frame of his 30s that we're talking about, in the very beginning of his 40s. So we're looking at the horizontality and how he emphasizes the horizontal board and batten. So you put planks of wood, and then the battens are the thin pieces of wood that cover the gap. And you typically would see that vertically in the 1800s, early 1900s. And he's doing it horizontally. He's also mimicking that horizontal board and batten with the bricks. This is actually brick and the way the bricks recess and protrude to create the horizontality. Also very thin bricks, and we could talk later about how he puts the mortar, recesses the mortar on the horizontal, but the little vertical gaps he leaves flush to even further accentuate the horizontality. And these are Roman bricks, very thin bricks, hard to build with. I could show another picture here of another wife's family's house where they built a chimney out of this. Her father did in a house they built with her father was also an engineer. Her father's father was also an engineer. So continued simple geometries you can see throughout the designs of this era, from influence of the wood foible blocks that he played with. He would reference them often. You can see it here again, the Martin Estate. Now this is a hillside home school, and this his aunts had a school. They actually had another one earlier on, and an earlier design, but this is when Frank Lloyd Wright is becoming very successful. This is on the grounds of Taliesin, and is still there and preserved. Now this is a great building that unfortunately got torn down in 1950. You can see the strong geometries here, but there's much more, and luckily the Historic Trust, Frank Lloyd Wright Historic Trust, has simulated it, so you can see some revolutionary ideas in using the computer to simulate what was there, and you get an idea of this office space, this open atrium space, and much nicer than the typical office buildings at that time. Plants, you have waterfalls. I believe an organ was in here too. He typically would incorporate a piano or organ in many of his designs, thanks to the influence of his father and the parallels between music and architecture that he often saw. So now recall from the last lecture about ages 20 to 33 that he had already had some influence, Japanese influence, inspirations from visiting the Chicago World's Fair in 1892, seeing this pavilion that was built, a reproduction of the Phoenix Pavilion in Kyoto that still exists. And you can see in the bottom here some of those designs we talked about in the last lecture. Now he takes his first trip to Japan, and now I'm taking photos that I'm showing photos that I had taken in 2013. And this was before these other photos, I believe, were available. They were in the archives in Taliesin and were not released until after 2013. And then I believe Columbia University may have them now. But then, recently, 3-4 years ago, I started seeing the similarities. So I put this together. So on the left is a photo by me in 2013. On the right is a photo by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1905. More than 100 years prior. Here's one up above by Frank Lloyd Wright, and these the gates between the human and spiritual worlds in the Shinto religion. And you can see the one on the left, a huge thing. That's a tractor trailer down on the ground there. You see, you can imagine the scale of it. The one on the right's not quite as big. It would be difficult to build it that big now or then. Here's walkways, gradual sloping walkways by me in Kyoto. Not sure where the one on the right is, but it looks very similar. By Frank Lloyd Wright over 100 years ago. Here's a Buddhist temple on the left, the picture that I took, and one on the right in Kyoto that Frank Lloyd Wright took. Here's another one by Frank Lloyd Wright in Nagoya. This is a bell tower that you're not supposed to ring. Of course, we had to do it. We got scolded a little bit. And a similar one in Nagoya on the right, one on the left in Kyoto. And then the large monuments in Kyoto on the left, Kobe on the right. And then the people, getting pictures of the people. So this is on the left of Kyoto, a large group of children, all colored hats, very organized and orderly. And on the right, more than 100 years prior, still most likely the group order, maybe even more. So then, natural rainwater collection on the left and on the right here, before long ago and recently, doing the same thing. And then the people, there's a mother and child on the left that I took a picture of in Kyoto, and one by Frank Lloyd Wright in Nagoya with a father and son. The geisha, now they're not prostitutes, they're meant to represent symbols of Japanese artistry, and they're cultured, and they have assumably the ultimate in manners, trained in the tea ceremony and the arts, and there's a whole lecture there for somebody who's a scholar in that. In this photo, you can see girls going back and forth between Kyoto College or Kyoto Kindergarten. There was no middle school or secondary high school there. It's a kindergarten and a college. And this is a residential neighborhood with a school embedded in it, and we stayed right near it. And there were several of these bridges over a canal that paralleled the big, one of the two larger rivers that run north-south. And then you see a photo on the right here, taken by Frank Lloyd Wright more than 100 years prior. This is a funny picture on a story on the left here. This is 2013. The Japanese do wear masks all the time. We're in 2020 now, and everybody's wearing masks, but the Japanese, I've experienced meeting them in other countries and traveling with them, that they just routinely wear masks in public spaces, especially away from home. And then on the right, here's a photo by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1905. Some children my son and I met in Kyoto, teaching us Japanese, and some children on the right, Frank Lloyd Wright, Nagoya. The Japanese gardens, if you ever have seen a Japanese garden, they're a beautiful thing. They're everywhere, of course, in Japan, and Narita, which it seems like just the airport town for Tokyo, New Tokyo Airport, but it's worth staying there in itself. I don't know how many acres, probably over 100 acres of beautiful Japanese garden. And then you see one on the right, taking a picture in Kyoto, perhaps the same one. It could be taken by Frank Lloyd Wright more than 100 years prior. So a picture on the left here of that same park and same Japanese garden in Narita, and then one on the right in Nagoya by Frank Lloyd Wright, the pathway. I have a whole lecture on Japanese urban design and architecture, where I'll talk about paths, amongst other things. This is a beautiful path. Just take away the note there. You could just sit and meditate looking at this. It's such a tranquil place. That's the whole idea. And if you haven't been in a big Japanese garden, you should really try. And here's a quote, Frank Lloyd Wright. He had a very strong ego. He always denied that he was directly influenced by Japanese architecture and design until later in his life, but still, in his writings, he would say it was just a coincidence, but it seems like much more than that. He says here in the quote, "The West could not have easily seen an indigenous organic architecture. Civilizations based on cultural inspiration, chiefly Buddhism, could. My work is in that deeper philosophical sense." Here's something, a story for another time. Perhaps when I come back and look at this in detail, come back and show you things. Now, I've been around Asian philosophy most of my life, teachings, and I was a teacher, a sensei of judo. Watashi wa judaka, watashi wa sensei shodan. And I had almost 200 students that I've promoted up to almost black belt. You can follow that link and see more about it, and a picture of my Grand Master there on the right. A story for another time. Now here is one thing I'd like to stop and take the time to read here. I've taught freshman seminars for 21 years as of making this lecture, and there was in several of them, two of them, especially the one involving judo, but also ones involving architecture, I had Japanese topics and Japanese cultural parts where I would ask guest lecturers, Nobu Takahashi, one of our Japanese professors, and Mahua Bhattacharya, the director of the Japanese program, to come in and give some inspirational talks and educational, informative talks on Japanese culture. And so she would give the students these 10 words, and I would have them memorize them because they speak to the Japanese culture and also there by extension to the architecture that comes from it. And then Frank Lloyd Wright, how he was inspired. And there's parallels between this philosophy and the Unitarian belief system that he grew up around, with his father as a preacher and his mother's strong Welsh Unitarian family. So omoyare is to be considerate, always be considerate. On means duty, right? The sense of duty. Ame means empathy, to actually feel the emotions of others, empathize. Wa, extremely important. Group harmony. We teach that in judo classes. By the way, I taught a very scientific, philosophical, soft form of judo rather than the hard MMA kind of thing that I do not care for. Uchi means inner or insider. That's important if you're part of the group or not. That can get out of hand sometimes. You get a little tribal with that. Even now, nowadays everywhere, not Japanese, more in other places. Kensan, modesty, right? That's very important. Giri, moral obligation. Soto, outside or outsider. Garaman, persistence. Enro, restraint, show restraint. And haji, shame. They can get a little carried away with that in Japan, but it's for the most part a very good thing to feel a little bit of shame if you are acting outside of cultural norms. So now look at a very important work of Frank Lloyd Wright, Unity Temple in Oak Park. Now this is made at a time where there are horse and buggies and Victorian architecture, nothing anywhere close to modern, and this is what he designs and builds, and it's an amazing structure. It must have seemed very much out of context at the time, but he's making a statement here, and you decide through the pictures and what you've seen in prior slides and on your own studies how you believe this is influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright's love of Japanese things. So this is the same year. He designs this, or it begins being built in the same year that he goes to Japan for the first time. Here is the layout of the building, the floor plan of the building. There's a loggia in between, and then a community space on the right. And the spaces on the right are sunken down, and the temple is area where people worship here. This is a Unitarian church, the form of Christianity, but open to many religions. And you can see in the previous lecture, the first lecture for this series, how that relates to the green environmental ethos and the organic design, and how it parallels certain Asian philosophies. So this temple, the floor is raised up, and of course you go through a narrow entrance to get into there, the compression and release technique, Frank Lloyd Wright. And then it's a grand space, and you definitely feel it as you come in. Now here's a picture of a Buddhist temple that I took in 2013, and you can see this is a typical design principle. Not just the altar raised up, but the whole floor raised up. And here's an excerpt from Architecture Theory course. This source here. Now this is by Francis Ching. This is an excellent book. And so you see pictures there talking about the elevated plane separates from surrounding and creates a domain with a larger spatial context. So that's a very important concept, and you can see that implemented in Unity Temple. So here's a picture on the inside of Unity Temple, of the temple part of the three-part complex. It's all Unity Temple, but this is the temple itself. And then he states about this, right, states, Unity Temple is where you will find the first real expression of the idea that space within the building is the reality of that building. Here's a model somebody made with my son standing behind it. This is in the loggia area of the temple, of the building. And then if you go to the video log between these times here for about 7 minutes or so, you can see some detailed walkthrough and pictures, still photos in there, as well as video narration of Unity Temple. This is a nice picture caught with the sunlight. So now it's talking about Japanese inspirations here. So now I say recall Roby House because we already talked about that when we talked about the pinwheeled planes and the cruciform, also with the banding of windows in the previous presentation. But we're talking about it again here. And so let's look and see if we can see any Japanese influence here. You decide. Compare this. This is the interior view here from the bottom left to the upper right, Shinto, a series of the Shinto shrines in Kyoto. So now let's look at something else. This is in River Forest. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright was very instrumental in the design of this. There were a couple other people involved in the design of it. There are wealthy members here, potential clients. And so this is right next to Oak Park, and he has a great deal of commissions all around this area. So arguably a good number of them came out of here. And you know, the catalog, the store catalog that I was using to find this had a little black and white photo and almost seemed like they had torn down the place. But I have a feeling that they weren't very receptive when he came to catalog this building. So we just walked in like we belonged there. And we walked around, saw the people. We didn't stay long, didn't disrupt anything. I walked into the interior space, and it's, you know, it's a country clubbish kind of place. It's not meant for everybody to just show up and party or tours. There's no tour of this officially. And then you can come back and read the history here if you like later. Or go into the video log and look at almost 12 minutes of us walking around this country club and taking still photos. So now here's another design. Now we're looking at some more Japanese influence. This is clearly shows that. Now let's talk about some things that were going on concurrent to when Frank Lloyd Wright was designing and also had some influence on him. The arts and crafts movement, which began in England and then moved to America and had its own form. And Frank Lloyd Wright, although not specifically an arts and crafts architect as such, is shown, as we'll see in the next slide here, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art on their arts and crafts movement page, with a picture on here of an entire room. This room was disassembled from the Frank Lloyd Wright Francis W. Little residence in Minnesota and reconstructed in the Met, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, including the windows. On this Met site, you can see this, what they say here, emerging during late Victorian period in England, There were anxieties about industrial life, and which fueled a revaluation of hand craftsmanship. So it's a cultural thing as well as a design thing. It's related, usually. Frank Lloyd Wright shaped a new way of living through his completely designed environments, which utilized natural materials, wood, clay, and stone, sparking a revolutionary shift in American interior. However, plain surfaces with minimal decorative embellishments were suited to incorporating the machine. So that's maybe a little different than other arts and crafts movements. Frank Lloyd Wright, he's quoted in other places, and you can see in my lectures here from his books, that he's not embracing the industrialization, but he's working within that context. So that's something to note. And then also on the same website, you'll see a mention of Green and Green, which they had a very important contribution to arts and crafts, and noting here that they are heavily influenced by Asian design. And so we'll see a building here designed in 1908. Remember, Frank Lloyd Wright went to Japan in 1906 and was already showing influences in Asian architecture. So you can look into that and how the two different designers, Green and Green versus Frank Lloyd Wright, similar in their, what inspired them. This is a famous house in Pasadena, California, by Green and Green, the Gamble House, and you can see the details within the house, as well as the influence, the Asian influence in the roof lines on the exterior. Also, the succession movement in Vienna, Austria. Now, this is not so much an architectural movement as a graphic design and a cultural type of movement, but you can see the lettering and the drawing, the imagery, and how that might play into what some things you see of Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, this period of his life, from age 34 to 41, from 1901 to 1908, was extremely productive. I have several pages here. This is just a Wikipedia list, but it's a very good one with pictures and links. And of course, you want to supplement with other peer-reviewed sources, but I encourage my students to just scroll through these. And in my design classes, you pick a couple that inspire you, typically more than one I ask for, and then come up with your own design. And spell out in your final presentation why exactly you picked those designs and what inspired you about those particular designs. And be specific about the elements that you're focusing on and the overall concepts. Reference organic design, the list of organic design concepts. And then show why you've done what you've done. So this is extremely productive time of Frank Lloyd Wright's life. The next period of time is not quite as productive, and there's a couple significant personal things that happened during that time. Now, at 41 years old, he also has 6 children and a family and quite a bit of responsibility on top of all these projects. And then the next period of time, things change quite a bit. And our final slide is just asking you to go and look in the video lecture, the video log, and it's also on my YouTube channel, and to look at the times listed there, which is a longer time than it's only a little over an hour. And this particular presentation, this era, has occupies most of this video log lecture that I made. of these 31 sites in and around Chicago, which is understandable because that's where Frank Lloyd Wright was doing all of his work at this particular time and became the most famous.